was on earth, and before any herb of the field sprang up. For God had not sent rain on the earth, and there was no man to till the ground. But a fountain came up from the ground and watered the whole face of the earth. Then God formed man out of the dust from the ground, and breathed in his face, and the breath of life, and the man became a living soul.
All right. Now, in what is the setting of God making heaven and earth, and of making Adam from the earth, from the dust of the ground, in that chapter 2, verse whatever it is, 5, 6, 7, whatever. What's the setting? What we just read in chapter 2, verse 3, that God rested on the Sabbath. He rested. And then immediately we go into God creating Adam, fashioning him from the earth. What's the setting? In what setting? In what context? In what state would you say? In what state? Exactly. He's resting, and he's creating Adam and Eve. What does that make you think of? Remember last week we said that the governing rubric for us interpreting Scripture is the death and resurrection of Christ. So look at it in the light of the death and resurrection of Christ. What does it say? That in his Sabbath rest, God creates Adam and then goes on to create Eve. And it'd be very interesting. It'd be very interesting for us to see how he creates Eve in this second creation account. Do you see? This is the prophecy. God is the first prophet. And he's already prophesying the mystery of his death and resurrection. The rest of God. We've said it before. What is the rest of God? What is the rest of God that it's referring to there? It's the death of God. It's God's death. So in his death, in his Sabbath rest, he recreates Adam. So the second creation account, when we read it in the light of the Christ's death and resurrection, it comes out now as the prefigurement, a prophetic act of God himself, prefiguring, already indicating to us the mystery of creation, that God himself is going to rest, he's going to die. And out of his rest, he's going to recreate Adam and Eve. Create Adam and Eve. He's going to create the church. So, this is why it's very important to me. I hope we'll be able to see it. Why we want to put in this commandment: don't eat from the tree, as one of these major outlines. But now now we can go back to chapter 1, go to the so-called first creation account, and find the first commandment that God gives to Adam and Eve in the first creation account. It's in chapter 1, verse 27 or so, 28, when he creates Adam and Eve in his image and likeness. Male and female creates he them, and then he gives them a blessing and a command. You remember what it is? Be fruitful and multiply. Now, we have then two creation accounts, and we have two first commandments. In the first creation account, the commandment is, be fruitful and multiply and subdue the earth. In the second creation account, the first commandment is, don't eat from that tree. Now again, looking at these two creation accounts, not from in a historical literary way, but rather in a theological way, reading it from the governing rubric of Christ's resurrection and his death and resurrection. Do those two commandments, if you think about those two commandments and look inside of them, as it were, and discern what their inner substance is, what's the inner meaning of those two commandments? Is there another commandment that the Lord gives that it makes you think of?
I'm sorry, sir.
Another commandment that the Lord gives that makes you think of. What did we read last week? Mark chapter 8, 34. The Sunday after the elevation of the cross. Let's read it all the way through. If you would follow me, if you would be my disciple, you must deny yourself, take up your cross, and follow me. He who would save his life will lose it. He who would lose his life for my sake in the Gospels will find it. Can you find that commandment in these two commandments here in Genesis? I'm going to mention it in my sermon again this morning. So you'll have a leg up on everybody else because you'll be looking for it. Let's see. Be fruitful and multiply. What part of the Lord's commandment in Mark chapter 8, verse 34 and following does that resonate? Does that sound like? Be fruitful and multiply. Let's back up. Let's go to the commandment in the second chapter of Genesis. Don't eat from that tree. What part of the Lord's commandment does that remind you of? Deny yourself. Take up your cross. Lose your life for my sake in the Gospels. And you will find it. And you'll be fruitful and multiply. You see it? You see it? So what I'm driving at is that the Lord's command given to us last Sunday after the elevation of the cross is not a new commandment at all. It's the commandment that he gave to Adam and Eve when he created them. Now we have that commandment distributed over 2 chapters in Genesis. But in effect, they're the one commandment that the Lord gives to us last Sunday. If you want, so he gives the command. He gives us the commandment: be fruitful and multiply, subdue the earth. Well, how are we going to do that? How do we go about being fruitful and multiplying and subduing the earth in the way that the Lord wants us to do it? We can't. Well, don't eat from that tree. In other words, follow the commandment. Deny yourself. And it's not that the tree was evil. I mean, we'll get to that. The tree was quite good. I mean, it says in chapter 2, the Lord himself is the one who planted that tree in the garden. So it was good. And it really didn't have anything to do with the tree itself. But there's some theological meaning that's hiding in there that we want to bring out. So if you want to be fruitful and multiply, if you want to find your life, this is how you do it. Deny yourself. Don't eat from that tree until I tell you to. Don't eat from that tree. Take up your cross and follow me. Lose your life for my sake. All right. All of that is embedded in this part of the outline of the commandment that I want to bring out, but we'll come back to it. So, but for now, let's move on. Let's continue to paint this in broad strokes. So after he creates Adam and gives to him the commandment, what's next? Then he creates Eve. I want to get that down as part of the major outline. Then he creates Eve. And I think it might be theologically significant that it's in this order. He creates Adam, and he gives the commandment, basically deny yourself, and lose your life for my sake, and then he brings Eve out from his side, from Adam's rib. I think there's some theological meaning that we want to bring out there, with the help of St Herman of Syria and St Maximus the Confessor. All right. So now, after he creates Adam and Eve, gives them the commandment, what's the next big thing that happens? What's the next big thing? Come on.
Creates animals.
What's that?
Creates all these animals.
Okay, that's that's one thing. Yeah, that's not what I'm looking for. But you're right. He doesn't create the animals.
Then he takes Eve out of his rib.
Okay, we've already mentioned that right there. So the next after that, the next
And then
big
there's
thing.
the whole, let's get to chapter 3 though.
Yeah, no. We're beginning. We're looking at chapters 1 to 4.
Oh.
So the next
Then
big
you
thing.
have the tree.
Yeah, and the fall.
And
All right, so there's the fall. There's the fall. It's interesting, you know, when you look inside the letter and try to discern the spirit in the letter, you could say that God is telling Adam and Eve that if you want to be fruitful and multiply, you must deny yourselves. But what do? They deny God. So they do not deny themselves, they deny God. And they fall. And then what happens after the fall? They're expelled. Their expense. And then we have from then on, we have, like starting in chapter 4, verse 1, we have the introducing the next, if you will, introducing the history of the world. That Adam knew Eve. So now we have the world of man, the world created by man, coming into existence. And the first act of that creation, of course, is the murder of Abel by Cain.
What was the thing with the throat that you mentioned?
Okay, well, we'll get back to that.
Because the commandment's really a fast.
You're right. We'll put that down. Okay, so we'll remember to come back to it. You're right, that's a good point. It's a fast. Denying yourself. That's what a fast is. He's commanding us to eat from him, not to let his will, let his commandment, his will, be our food and drink. No, not our own will. Be our food and drink. Like the Lord says, my food is to do the will of the Father who sent me. Right? Now, what I want us to see now is that well, okay, in the fall, and before God expels Adam and Eve, remember there's this dialogue that takes place, and there's a series of what would you call them? They're generally understood as curses and as blessings. Cursed is the ground because of you. And from the sweat of your brow you shall eat your bread. To Eve he says, you shall take your refuge in your husband. And to Adam he says, you will eat your bread by the sweat of your brow. And you will, the ground will now yield to you thorns and thistles, and so forth and so on. And you have to till, you have to work. He was given the commandment in the first place to work the garden, so he wouldn't do it. He just wanted to eat from the tree that he wasn't supposed to eat from, and so now he's going to have to work the ground. He'll have to work it anyway. What's interesting is what strikes me in all of this, in the midst of this dialogue that God has with Adam and Eve, is what he says is the kind of final sentence. From the ground you were taken, to the ground you will return. Now, I've been thinking about that. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. Now, the word for earth, Gia, is the same word. I believe, I need to check the Greek. I believe it's the same word that you find in the end of chapter 3. When he says that from the earth you were taken, from Gia you were taken, from the earth you shall return. Maybe we should check that out real quick. So if the ground that Adam was taken from was created by God, then the ground, is it a bad thing? Okay. So he's saying, the earth and your works, and sorry will eat. Okay, yes, it's Gia. Yes. So it's the same word. Because there are different words for ground and for dust. That's why I wanted to verify.
What about earth or clay?
No, it's a different word.
That's a different
Yeah,
word.
it's a different word. So you made from the clay of the earth. So he says, so yeah, I don't know, is that significant? Is that interesting? Should we take note of that? He does not say you are taken from the chun, the clay. He says you are taken from the earth, which is the word that is found, that's given in the very beginning. God creates the heaven and the earth. I suppose if I were a biblical scholar governed by historical literary